Vera, thank you for joining us on our next Liverpool Fashion Summit interview. So officially it's Dr. Vera Hoelscher, have I said that correctly?
That is right, yes. Thank you so much for having me.
No, our pleasure. So Vera is a lecturer in marketing at Royal Holloway, and I hope you don't mind me saying, but had a baby not too long ago?
That is correct. 2 days into UK lockdown, yes.
2 days into UK lockdown. So gonna have a very interesting first couple of years, I think, as we start to move out of this whole situation.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
And yes, also with regards to even, just connecting the topic of fashion to having had a baby, there's just so much in terms of sustainability and baby clothes, etc., that we're starting to consider now, or have considered also before she was born. And in some parts it's quite easy to go along with that, just also from a consumer perspective. And other parts it's just really quite hard to live up to our own standards. For instance, say we actually wanted to buy everything used for her, and we bought on almost everything, and we bought most clothes for her used, but it's just at the moment it's just the postal office where we live in Streatham pretty much just stopped working. Stuff arrived a month later. At that time it won't fit her anymore, so it's just not necessarily an option right now to go to eBay or to drop by on people's doorsteps to actually pick things up. So it's putting a little bit of a damper on that situation. But pardon the pun, we are using reusable nappies, and that is going relatively well. So.
There's a short story in there. We were just talking about short stories before. But I mean, Vera, we're straight in here because there's a bit of a moral conundrum here, I think, that you've just highlighted already, in that you said that it's really difficult to hold ourselves up to and myself as an academic as well, to hold ourselves up to those moral or ethical standards that we preach about. So how do you personally square that circle, sort of as an individual?
It is extremely difficult, especially as a parent. So on the one hand, we're discussing, should we transition into zero waste, a vegan lifestyle, because all of the information is out there and it's so clear that this is the lifestyle that would be best to pursue for planetary health, as well as also, of course, for our daughter's future. But on the other hand, it is incredibly difficult. The onus is on the consumer, the onus of making the research, of making the right choices. And I'm not sure if you've watched The Good Place, which you can, I think, watch on Netflix. I think it's a Netflix original. And there is this kind of, they tell the story of this mythical place called Heaven. Well, it turns out, I don't want to give away too much, but basically it turns out to be almost impossible to get into heaven, because every time you make a consumption choice, even buying the wrong tomatoes, like well, maybe they weren't meat or whatever, but maybe they were from colonized land or what have you, and it's so incredibly difficult. And there's always another conundrum that you reach. Also from a very personal perspective. So when I started back then working on my PhD, I looked a lot also, so my PhD is in ethical consumption, and I looked a lot at the fair trade logo and the effectiveness of that, etc. And of course, there were wonderful speakers, also practitioners, who were invited to Royal Holloway, for instance, from Stop the Traffic, to talk about it. And there's been a lot of focus on chocolate. So my husband was like, let's only buy fair trade chocolate, etc. But then it's like, where do you even stop? Because in all of these different products, you wonder, like, well, there's no, say, chocolate, or this is like a fruit-based product or whatever. But if there's sugar, for instance, sugar is also a huge fair trade issue. The picking of fruits and vegetables is also a huge fair trade issue, even if we just look at it, dare I say, domestically in Europe. There's always another can of worm that's being opened. So
Yeah.
yes.
And that's a fantastic answer. And I don't know whether we'll have time to do this today, but hopefully we can again at some point, because there's something about, for me anyway, there's something about the perfect individual. Everything's fair trade, everything is sustainable, everything is without exploitation. There's something about the one perfect individual in 100 versus 80% of those 100 people. So 80 people all doing just a little bit, just maybe changing how they buy clothes, or maybe changing the type of food that they eat, or where their food may come from. And I think whilst that one individual as a role model is fantastic to have, as we've just sort of highlighted, holding yourself to that high level of regard is really, really difficult. I do personally. I don't know about you. I think it's much better for 80 of us to all do a little bit, and I think it's happening slowly.
Well, I think it needs to be more than a little bit, but it's also something that perhaps we can transition towards. So
Yeah.
it's really difficult to go cold turkey and to stop consuming any, for instance, animal product or any product that perhaps it's to some degree was the product of slave labor, because it is so hidden in supply chains. And also domestically, there's so much domestic trafficking, domestic slave labor. So I think it's almost unrealistic for consumers alone to actually be able to achieve that perfect status. I don't think that there's even 1 in 100. I think maybe there's 1 in a million who can do that. However, if we all transition towards something more sustainable, if we all actually think together that re-wearing fashion, or for instance also exchanging more fashion items, or perhaps also buying straight from the farm when it comes to produce or what have you, then perhaps we can actually together collectively reach something realistic. And that's perhaps what you were alluding to, something realistic.
Yeah, I think so. Something a bit practical, you know, so a bit more pragmatic than what we currently have. But we've just fantastic segue. We've got onto consumption, onto buying, swapping, things like that. I just want to have a little chat with you about some recent research that you did, and the paper's published. It was published March last year, I believe. It's called Ethical Consumption Communities Across Physical and Digital Spaces. So, oh, and by the way, you have my absolute favorite new word. I don't know how to pronounce it, but chorophilia, something like that.
Chorophilia, yes. So that was actually something that my co-author Andreas Chatsidakis, who is Greek, so he coined that term. So I have to give full credit where it's due. And that was, so he was also my doctoral supervisor. That was during those days, like, Vera, I think we need something more. I think, what about this word? I thought of this word. And so just to explain the etymology a little bit more. So in the reading from that work, I found Tuan's concept of topophilia particularly interesting and salient and relevant. And topophilia means love for place. So topo, of course, place, philia, love. I think most people would be a little bit more acquainted with that kind of connection.
Yeah.
And what that means is that we start loving the places around us. So the more the more time we spend in a space, the more likely it is to become a place for us. So that we know its in and outs, that we become embedded into it. So this is where topophilia stems from. But Tuan also actually wrote, and he allowed for that concept, to almost feel a little bit limiting and at times maybe even claustrophobic. So the whole concept of place can also be limiting. And I'm gonna have to say it again. I think my paper, because it obviously just like my baby came out just in the beginning of the lockdown and of the pandemic. So perhaps there's a little bit more that we can take away from that paper than I would have wished for all of us. However, there's this notion that it can be quite limiting to only be within our own four walls. We need to have space to think. We crave that as well. And I think this is also something that perhaps the people who listen to this can relate to, that they are starting to crave space, openness, etc. So new spaces to be filled with our thoughts, with these longings, with these desires, perhaps a different lifestyle. And a different lifestyle, not just in the real estate sense, but also very much in the kind of, this is where I want to go with my life. This is the kind of lifestyle that I want to take away from this, because perhaps we have grown also through the different lockdowns and thought about how we want to continue afterwards and how we want to position ourselves afterwards, also in a wider sense of a sustainable but still enjoyable future. So this is where horophilia perhaps then comes in, because it's a love for space. So horo means space, and it's this desire for that space, for gaining a new space that perhaps can be used to realize our projects within it. And of course, it's a very temporal concept. So you're going to think, well, you know what, Vera, that only lasts for a short time, right? Because the more time you spend in that space, it's going to become a place. And yes, completely right. So there's this recurrent kind of looking for a new space when perhaps the old one has become a place, but also places can become spaces again. So it's very much kind of an individual feeling, perhaps. So what for you could be a place is for me a space, vice versa. And it's something that can quite fluidly develop, really.
I think you've so many questions, but I know what you have done with beautiful linguistic flair is sort of you've sort of taken a phenomenological approach, a sort of feeling-based approach to spaces and places, and how we interact with the world around us, which is, you could have stopped there, and that's fascinating in itself. So if I could ask one question, what would it be? Where do these constructs sort of then feed into ethical consumption, or the ethics of consumption?
So I think, so in the paper itself, what we found in the data, Andreas and I, was that these consumption communities, or rather individuals within them, because our unit of analysis was still the individual within those communities, that they started craving these spaces. So of course, this is all pre-pandemic. And for instance, one of them, she's referred to as Valerie in the paper. So you identify the quote yourself. And she speaks about how she's arrived in London and how she is originally from the countryside, but now she's living with friends. And she did join this project. She joined this community project, but they're only managing a space. They're kind of custodians of this space. And she gets told by the others, okay, today you can do some weeding, or you can do a little bit of watering, etc. But she was starting to really crave a space of her own, so to speak, something that she could manage herself, something over which she would have the ability also to make decisions, like where can I take the space, what kind of, in this case, she was very much interested in, growing her own food, etc. Where can she take that? And she thought that she could find it somewhere else, and she had a very exact idea of where that would be. And that was my other fieldwork site. It was a squat. It turned out he didn't enjoy squat life that much. Okay, but nonetheless, it's always this kind of this idea, perhaps in a different space, I could realize these dreams, I could realize these ideas. And I think this is also where ethical consumption can come in more widely, because at the moment we're imagining, if only things were different, if only I was able to have this and that, then I could do that and that. If only I had my own garden. So this is, of course, just kind of extending Valerie's idea. If only I had my own garden, I could grow my own food. That kind of thing. Feel more free around it. And I think this is something where perhaps this is very limiting as well, because of course, again, it's temporal. So we move on, we find a space, and then our realities really collide with those realities that are already inherent in the space, you know, because it's something that also, for instance, the geographer Massey has very similarly put forward before we touched this, is that it's a very kind of colonial thought to say, okay, I'm going to go somewhere else and I'm going to realize all of these ideas there, and that space is kind of uncharted territory. No, this isn't uncharted territory. Somebody else has also realized their ideas within that, and perhaps for them it's a place already. So no matter whether that is perhaps a fashion forum or a charity shop or what have you, all of these ways in which we can consume very ethically, perhaps it's I don't think that there is much uncharted territory. This isn't to say that there aren't some grand new ideas out there, but it is kind of limiting to say, well, only if only, you know, it's this if only, it's this desire that is almost located nowhere.
So is it I'm going to ask a question, don't know whether I've understood you correctly, please correct me if I haven't. So is it for the majority of us then who either desire to shop ethically or don't see how they can, would sort of your research imply that these are self-imposed limitations?
I totally see how you would interpret it as that way, 100%, and maybe it could even be thought of in that way. But however, I firmly believe, also from the kind of the data, the research of my colleagues, and also from a personal perspective, that the onus very much lies with the producer. So I think at the moment we are kind of, these different spaces and places are being also really set out for us by the system, by capitalism, by multinational corporations, and also governments, etc., that don't really allow us to get to the space where we want to be, you know. So I would definitely not say that the onus is with the consumer. That would be entirely unfair. And I just don't think it's also realistic. We can't just recycle our way out of this, or we can't just close our way out of this. I'm not saying that doesn't help. Of course it does. And of course, every time we make a choice to consume something that has a lower carbon footprint and that has less cruelty attached to it, whether towards people or also animals, because you could expand that also to notions of animals. Certainly something that I know my dear colleague Deirdre Shaw also would support. At the moment, the system is not set up in this way that is conducive to that. It's just not in the interest of those who hold the power within the system.
Yeah. So what role? So we've kind of identified this dyad between consumers and, let's say in the sense of fashion, retailers and producers as well. Those who bring X to the market and those who take X from the market. Mm-hmm. Where do you see the role of sort of governments or governance structures around that sort of relationship?
At the moment, I think governments are very much supportive of the production side of things. Yes, they very much kind of protect consumer rights. No doubt about that from one perspective. But sometimes certain issues they receive a huge platform, and rightly so. I completely agree that issues such as, for instance, testing products on animals, that's a huge issue, and that's something that has had a huge platform. Rightly so, not arguing against that. But then I wonder, so why is it completely fine then to purchase chocolate, say, or a dress that's been made by a child along the way? You know, it's like, what is the platform for that? And there is, of course, I'm not saying that they don't have a platform, of course, and with, for instance, Stop the Traffic is doing fantastic work. Andreas, Deirdre, and Mikhail, they're also doing fantastic work from the research side, and they're really having an impact with that work. They're really bringing it to Parliament, etc. But I think that overall, there needs to be more of exactly that wonderful work. But on the other hand, so now it's almost as if I'm kind of pushing the onus back to the consumer to just kind of campaign more, boycott more, etc. And I really don't think it is just that. I really think that it has to come from legislation, and that legislation and policies have to have a wider look at also the consistency of things. This is what I'm really trying to get at. I think it's inconsistent to say that only happy eggs are good eggs. Did I quote a brand name? In that case, I'm sorry, but only happy eggs are good, or what have you. And then on the other hand, say, well, maybe, you know, that child has also had horrible conditions to work under, but there isn't a label that necessarily encompasses that all. Yes, of course, there's the fair trade label, for instance, and that's also very important work. Marketing-wise, it's had a tremendous success, and now it's just so all-pervasive. But for instance, the Fair Trade Association, so the Max Havelaar, sometimes it's not necessarily stringent enough. The kind of requirements in order to get that logo. You know, if, for instance, as Starbucks, you can have that quite easily, then it's also problematic in its own right. So I think I would want to call for policymakers to just be a little bit more consistent with an anti-cruelty stance, for instance, or with a CO2 stance.
I'm wary of time, because we've said to everyone, and it'll be on the website and Twitter, that we're keeping these to 25 minutes. So I have so many more questions. I hope we can do a part 2, actually. Maybe.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for now, Vera. Thank you for now.
Thank you so much.